I was conflicted about having this piece on the show, Chris, because this being a religious topic and it being a topic about God, obviously, something like this gets out there into the public and people that are non-believers, they start to think, oh my goodness, look at all those Christians suing each other. They're not really Christians. And there's an element of damage it could possibly do to the kingdom of God. And then, there's also, Chris, there's some scripture out there about not taking your disputes to pagan courts. And that's exactly what I think has gone on here. Welcome to Silberman Law Firm's Weekly Docket, episode 68, where we talk legal news and practical law. Today is May 1st, 2025. I'm your host, owner of the law firm, Phil Silberman, and I'm joined by my co-host, Christopher Heald, who's the firm's supervising attorney. How are you doing today, Mr. Heald?
On the rug instead of under it, so it's a good day.
Good day. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about what is on our docket today. We're going to talk a little bit about the election ruling, Spring Branch Independent School District. That's a school district local to the Houston area. And there was a federal court ruling saying that their school board elections are illegal. So we'll be talking about that a little bit. Then we're going to talk about the big Second Baptist lawsuit. So Second Baptist is a mega church in Houston. They had a pastor try to do some sort of hostile takeover, and a bunch of deacons in the church are kind of affiliated with a nonprofit. They filed a lawsuit to stop all that. And then we're going to transition to our legal questions section where we're talking about fixture law in real estate. That sounds really uninteresting, and spoiler alert, it is fairly uninteresting, but we have to talk about it. And then we're going to rant and rave a little bit about a story that's not getting much coverage, which is some of our migration trends in Texas, our domestic migration trends. That's the number of people domestically in the United States that are moving to Texas and what those numbers have looked like recently. But all right, let's go ahead and get it kicked off with our legal news section. And we're talking about this SBISD lawsuit. I think it's Elizondo versus SBISD. Now, Chris, we actually both have children that attend this school district.
We do.
Are you been happy with the school district so far?
Of course. Delighted.
There's been some interesting developments here. A lot of people are saying that this one case is going to ruin the school district. And
why is it going to ruin the school district?
Here's the thing. In Spring Branch ISD, we do elections, which by a system called at-large elections. That's opposed to a single member district election. Can you explain to the listeners what the difference is?
As best I understand it, which may not be very well, at-large means that the whole group of people votes for everybody instead of segmenting it and saying this portion of the district votes for place 1, that portion of the district votes for place 2, and this other section of the district votes for place 3. We just throw everybody in the same pot and they all vote for all 3.
Yeah, that's probably the best and most concise explanation that I've heard. So well done. Just for some comparison purposes, our U.S. House of Representatives, that's a single member district election system, right? You draw a district, everybody who lives in that district gets representation from the U.S. House rep that we elect. For Spring Branch ISD, we don't do that. Anyone who lives in the school district can go and vote for school board members. Now, the problem or the alleged problem with that, Chris, is apparently only conservative rich people go to the polls. Poor people really don't turn out for voting too often. That's the idea. So because of that, in this school district that we're talking about, there's a big freeway called Interstate 10 that runs right through the middle of it. People on the north side are generally poor people. People on the south side are generally rich people. That's not always true. There are some very nice neighborhoods north of I-10. So hopefully I'm not insulting anybody, but generally that is true. And the idea is that only rich people, rich conservative people on the south side are turning up to vote. So only rich conservative people are being elected to board positions. And all the more working class people north of I-10, they're not getting fair representation. What do you think, Chris? Do you buy that argument?
Don't you have to? Anything that doesn't segment is obviously going to benefit one side, whether intentionally or unintentionally.
Yeah.
It would be the same as if you took every House district in Houston and made it one. You'd have a much more homogenous looking House of Representatives, and
Mhm.
you wouldn't get the diversity. So, for good or for bad, whichever side you're on, it does sound like by doing that, you're definitely skewing it towards whichever group shows up is going to get all three. You're not going to have this
Well,
representation.
I think it's undisputed that wealthier, more educated people tend to turn up at the polls. That is a sort of a given. And if you're trying to help people that are not as well off, they get some representation, then it's a pretty good argument that an at-large system is going to benefit wealthier people. Now, the counter argument to that, Chris, is the poor people can obviously show up and vote because the federal judge in this case said that the at-large system violates the Voter Rights Act. And I don't know if that's necessarily true. Obviously, their voter rights are not being violated. They can still show up and vote. It's just that they don't. So this will certainly get appealed. And
So let me
yeah,
ask you this. Let's say there's more people in place one. I'm going to say we have three places. Let's say there's more in place. Those are what you're classifying as the lower income people. And say
okay.
they do turn out and say they
Right.
sweep all three. What do you think is going to happen next year? I bet you the upper class people find a way to segregate it so they get two of the three next time instead of letting the other guys.
Yeah, yeah, you just reversed it in a way that could happen but never happens in the real world, and that's a good point, though. Lower class, poorer areas tend to be more densely populated, but they just don't go vote. So the richer neighborhoods on the south side of the freeway, less densely populated, bigger lots, bigger houses. So you've got less voters, but they're the ones showing up to vote. And that's just the way this works. Let me ask you this though, and I thought about this. There's all this publication of people in Spring Branch ISD don't show up and do something about this. It's going to ruin the school district. And what's the reasoning behind that? Are you aware of the theories, Chris, or not really?
No, I am curious to hear. I don't know what that argument is.
So I was also unsure about it. And I said, well, what's going to happen? Does that mean if the poor people get elected, are all the poor people going to start voting for a bunch of money to go to their schools? And my wife, who's a very intelligent person, said, no, not necessarily, because there are bonds for that kind of thing. And maybe, but I think the idea, and I did a little research on this, the idea is that if you give the poor people representation, then their values are going to start being inserted into the board and into the curriculum. Poor people tend to be more liberal. I guess that's true. They're going to start doing all this DEI stuff. So you let more representation, less conservative, more liberal people. All of a sudden, Spring Branch is putting more DEI content in the curriculum. The library books are getting more risque. You're doing more homosexual publicity in the content of the library books. That's not necessarily my theory. I'm just saying that's the argument for those types of values creeping into a conservative school district. You buy it or you don't buy it.
If they change it and they do, is that the question? Is if they change it to three people running in three separate districts?
Yeah. Do we end up with a more liberal curriculum?
Well, I guess I understand the argument is they're saying then you get more representation for people who might not think like the rich white people. And
Yeah.
feel what you can. If people don't think alike, then they have to work together and figure it out.
Yeah, I don't know how much that theory is really going to play out in Spring Branch ISD, and here's why. North of the freeway tends to be heavily Hispanic, right? And the Hispanic people are not as liberal as Democrats have thought them to be, and that's evidenced by the recent Trump election, where all of these districts in the valley overwhelmingly went for President Trump. So the Democrats who have been more left, more liberal, they've always thought they could count on the Hispanic vote. And that's proven that they can't. So north of the freeway being more Hispanic, I don't think it's just a given that all of a sudden you're going to get these more liberal values. In fact, I think it could be the opposite. I know some very wealthy liberal people over in my neighborhood and the villages that vote very far left. So you might get some more conservative values by including some of the Hispanic population. Just to throwing that out there. I don't know how that comes out, but anyway, there it is. We've done good work, Chris. We've reported on the case. We've talked about the Voter Rights Act. We've given the public the information. Hopefully, we've explained what an at-large school district is versus single member district, because I actually did not know until I did the show. So there you have it. But
It makes sense. And anybody who has power doesn't want to give up power. If you think you can get more representation by having smaller districts, you're going to advocate for that. If you think you can get more representation of your ideas by having fewer districts, you're going to advocate for that. It's just that. It doesn't matter whether it's rich, poor, left, right. People want power. People want people who think like them in power, representing their views. And if they can legally kind of redraw lines and skirt some issues and say, this is just the system, and it favors you, that's going to be your argument. And if it doesn't favor you, you're going to say, hey, I think this doesn't accurately represent the population and we need to change it. So.
Yeah, that's actually a perfect transition. The idea of people just wanting power is a perfect transition into our next legal news story, which is this big Second Baptist lawsuit. You're familiar with the church, Second Baptist, Chris?
I'm not a native Houstonian, but I do know of the church. I've never attended the church, but I'm certainly familiar with it.
It's a big mega church, okay? And it's the main campus is down on Woodway, and I think they've got some other satellite campuses as well. The church has had a longtime pastor named Dr. Ed Young, and Dr. Young had been there a very long time. And as we all do, Dr. Young got older. And Dr. Young decided he wanted to install his son by the name of Ben Young to be pastor over the church. Now, I think not everybody quite liked Ben as much as they liked Dr. Ed Young. Ben has a bit of a checkered past. Or Ben has been divorced. And I don't know this for certain, but the story out there, and this was all very much covered up by the church, the story out there is that Ben was not divorced for biblically permissible reasons. They chewed that they brushed that under the rug, didn't publicize it so much, and then brought him back as a pastor. And now that Dr. Young has gotten old, he is trying to install Ben Young. I don't know that anybody has any real issues with him having been divorced, although I would point people to some biblical scripture for qualifications for overseers and deacons and things like that in the church, where I think it requires you to be the husband of but one wife. The more prevalent interpretation being that you're only allowed to be married once and not having been divorced for non-biblical reasons. But that aside, I don't think that's what people are concerned with. People are more concerned about this idea that Ben just tried to do this hostile takeover of the church. So we don't exactly have all the details, but it was something like the allegations are that Ben snuck in some amendments to the bylaws that allowed him to gain complete control of the church. So Chris, this is something that we know a lot about. That's bylaws. Can you explain to the listeners the general organizational structure of maybe a corporation and how bylaws work and what you're supposed to do to amend them?
The structure of a corporation or a nonprofit, you're going to have a board, and the board is going to pass bylaws, which is their operating procedure. It's the rules that govern our organization. And so when you form the organization, you have to have rules. And so when you pass the bylaws, you say, these are the rules that we're going to follow. And then hopefully everybody follows them.
Yeah, exactly. The board is supposed to adopt initial bylaws. Bylaws can be amended. Usually you need some sort of very high level of vote, potentially by shareholders or board members. Nonprofits don't have shareholders. They typically have board members. I think minimum you have to have 3. and there's some mechanism for adopting or changing bylaws. The allegations are that through some sort of breach of fiduciary duty or fraudulent misrepresentation, the board members were duped into losing their voting rights, something like that. Okay. And this lawsuit that was brought by this nonprofit is saying it was fraudulent and we want our voting rights back. They're not asking for any monetary relief. They're just asking for injunctive relief to restore the voting rights. We see this a lot outside of the church context in HOA set. Chris, can you talk a little bit to the listeners about what you've seen and what goes on in some of these HOA fights?
Yeah, we do get a lot of calls. We do get a lot of complaints about people wanting to do things within the neighborhood and then the HOA not allowing them to do what they want to do, even though they're trying to follow the proper procedure and just not allowing them to be heard, or HOA having closed door meetings where they say, okay, we decided we're going to do this. And they didn't really put it up for a public vote or a discussion, and they just do it however they want to do it. We've seen them amend voting procedures mid-election. I think one of the funny ones we had was they had an election period that they said, okay, everybody return your ballots by May 30th, and May 30th came and they didn't have enough to get what they wanted. So they said, let's go to June 30th and let's go collect some more ballots until they got what they wanted. So obviously that's going to not sit well with some people.
Yeah. And HOAs and churches are similar in the sense that they're both not-for-profit or nonprofit corporations. So anytime you've got those kinds of organizations doing elections or doing some type of amendment process, the whole thing is typically ripe for error and scrutiny. So that's obviously what's going on here with the Ben Young situation. They're saying that it wasn't a proper process. When we do these HOA disputes, we also see these very similar allegations about the process and whether it was done in accordance with the bylaws. Do you know this? I've got a lot of friends in the area, and there's an absolute exodus of members from Second Baptist, pun very much intended. Chris, I don't know if you got that exodus pun. There's an absolute exodus of people from Second Baptist heading over to First Baptist usually. I do
Send also them to the Catholic Church. We welcome all.
Chris is giving a plug for the Catholic Church over there. Yeah, hey, so there's some of that going on, and I was conflicted about having this piece on the show, Chris, because this being a religious topic and it being a topic about God, obviously, something like this gets out there into the public, and people that are non-believers, they start to think, oh my goodness, look at all those Christians suing each other. They're not really Christians. And there's an element of damage it could possibly do to the kingdom of God. And then, there's also, Chris, there's some scripture out there about not taking your disputes to pagan courts. And that's exactly what I think has gone on here, is we have some of the church members who are probably almost certainly behind. I don't know for certain. I haven't looked at the details of whatever the name of this nonprofit is, but there likely are some members affiliated with this nonprofit filing the lawsuit against Second Baptist. And you clearly have people purporting to be Christians taking their disputes to pagan courts. And I think that's something you have to do very prayerfully and with a lot of thought and consideration. So this has been a big story in not just the local neighborhood, but also all over the city, and it's getting some coverage out there. I know it's not how Ed Young wanted it to go down in the transition. I think sometimes as fathers, you might have children who are not as righteous, godly, and competent as you are. And there's a lot of scriptural evidence for scriptural support of that. And I think reminded there was a priest by the name of Eli who had a couple sons who were just absolutely awful. And just because you have sons and you're a priest, that doesn't necessarily mean, or a pastor, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to inherit that kind of position. But we're people, and there are a lot of problems, and not perfect. There's a lot going on over at Second Baptist, not just at the church, but also at the school. And I think it's fair to say that there's officially something rotten in Denmark over there. So we'll see how that comes out. All right, that brings us to our legal questions section. And this is a boring one. We've got to answer it, Chris. What is a fixture in real estate? Tell the listeners what a fixture is.
A fixture is just anything that's attached to the property. A building is a is attached to the property, and then anything affixed to the building. So
Yeah.
appliances, anything that's nailed down, I kid you not, we've got a dispute right now over $200 worth of stereo speakers that were mounted to a wall.
That's a high dollar. That's a high dollar case we've
Yeah.
got. If there's
$200. Well, it stopped the whole real estate transaction, stopped the whole real estate deal because of $200 worth of speakers.
Okay. Yeah. So examples, speakers, HVAC systems, built-in appliances, refrigerators that are attached, dishwashers bolted down. Those are always considered fixtures. Fixtures typically transfer with the property. It's that simple. So when does this become an issue? It's usually from a lender perspective where you're worried about getting a security interest or a lien in all of this stuff on the property. And the way we handle this in Texas and most all over the country is in your deed of trust. We use a deed of trust in Texas. That's the security agreement. And you get all of the stuff attached as a security interest when you file the deed of trust in the real property records. You don't have to do anything extra in the other records. That's the Secretary of State where you file some other liens for personal property. You don't need to do anything additional. So why all the time, Chris, are in commercial transactions, are we sometimes worried about filing what we call a UCC1, which is a financing statement with the Secretary of State to maybe get some additional lien rights? Why? Tell the listeners why we might be worried about.
I think it's just the added security or sense of security for anything that may not be tied down, so to speak, right? And they're saying, okay, whether it's actually nailed to the floor or not, we have an interest in it. So refrigerators that are not, speakers that are not tied down. Stuff like that.
Absolutely. So it can, Chris is hinting at the issue, which is sometimes it's confusing, right? Like you can think of extreme situations. Clearly the HVAC system that's all in the house and bolted down and a complete full integration is almost certainly a fixture. But then you've got the other extreme of that. If you've got some sort of potted plant or you've got some sort of, I don't know, what sits in the yard or sits somewhere, or a refrigerator in your garage that's not bolted down that just slides around, that's clearly personal property. So you do have some in-betweens. And one of the best examples I think I came up with were these solar panels in Texas and we do a lot of cases with solar panels, even though Chris doesn't like them. But Chris, most of the time the solar panels are mounted on the roof.
Right.
So is that a fixture or is that personal property?
That is a fixture.
Probably a fixture because it's attached. You would think that you don't want the thing to blow off the roof. You might also do you can have a whole test over what a fixture is. And one of the big factors in the test is how much damage does it do when you remove it. So maybe if you remove the solar panel from your roof, it's going to do a lot of damage to your roof. That would give you some evidence that maybe it is fixtures. But you could, Chris, also just have a big solar panel sitting on the ground and out in a rural property, and maybe it's staked into the ground some kind of way. But you get into that, is that personal property or is it not? And as Chris said, if there's any doubt, just do both. Put it in the security agreement, put it in your deed of trust, file in the real property records, of course, like you normally do. But then also pull out the UCC1, describe the property, file with the Secretary of State, do both. So as attorneys, we're always looking for fail safes and belt and suspenders types of approaches. That's the way I come down on it. Chris, you have any other comments on that?
That's really the only way to do it. And
okay, we'll leave off of this as a boring one, but we had to answer it. We certainly don't want to make this topic a fixture of our podcast at any point in the future. Give me some love on that dad joke, Chris. Give me some love on that dad joke. How long have I been saving that for this?
I could tell that you had it teed up.
Yeah. All right. That brings us to my favorite part of the show, which is our rant and rave section. And this is a rant about this story just not getting much news, not getting much coverage. And this is a Texas migration slowdown. We've got some numbers here. Net domestic migrants. That sounds confusing. Can you explain what that is, Chris? What is it? No, Chris, I don't know.
Net means we take the people who left and the people who came, and you call that a net number of people who migrated to Texas.
But what's the domestic component of that?
Oh, people moving intrastate.
Yeah.
Inter
No, yeah. Interstate. It has to be in the United States. We're not counting other countries like Mexicans coming over the border or Guatemalans or Hondurans or whatever. This is just US people moving from other states to Texas. And this is big news because that number was 191,000 in 2023 and it dropped to 85,000 in 2018. Chris, is that less than half? I think it's less than half. Yeah. It was 191 in 2023 and big drop, 85,000 in 2024. So that's a huge percentage decrease. That puts us at the lowest since 2018. And this normally ebbs and flows with the economy. And there's typically a lag of it. So the theory is that 2014, 2016, we had this big decline in oil prices. Chris, you may remember it's like I think I started the firm in late 2013. I think we hired you in early 2014. We were for like you probably forgotten this, but for a couple months, we were like just so busy with real estate transactions. And we had this other guy at the firm, and his job was to do all the real estate transactions, and your job was to do all the probate. And the real estate transactions just dried up. And that was because, if you've forgotten, Chris, oil fell off a cliff like in 2014. So that's what happened. So
I
anyway,
do remember all that. And this actually seems to make a lot of sense to me. I knew nothing about this before you brought it up, but it actually makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad you referenced 2018 because that's what I was thinking. Is okay, you tell me it dropped precipitously over the last year, but let's compare it to pre-COVID, because what I remember from COVID was everybody moving, everybody buying houses, and half of our clients were Californians. So they've moved here. How many can be left to move here?
yeah,
So,
that's a good point. They're all done. They moved here. They're all done.
yeah, how long could that sustain? So that all makes logical sense to me.
The peak migration, kind of that post-COVID migration, was 2022. We had 225,000. That was the peak. That was the post-COVID thing. So now you're speculating. You've brought up a good theory about why this decline. And some of the theories, your theory was, hey, they all came here in COVID. They're just done. So now the good news is people are still coming. We still had 85,000 people positive net migration into Texas, but we've had that kind of growth for a while. We're looking at this from like an economic indicator. So if you're doing things like business planning, which, everyone should cry and feel sorry for people like me because it's really hard to plan for business when you have so much moving around in this country right now. But if you're looking at business planning, you're wondering, hey, what is this telling us? And there's some theories. Chris had a good one. They're just all done coming. They've come. Another theory is interest rates are high and the home prices are already way up. There are no deals left here anymore. People were coming here because we were cheap relative to other states like California and New York. And maybe we're still cheap relative to that, but we're not that cheap. So there's just, maybe there's no deals, high interest rates. And then you also have this aging theory where people are getting older. So maybe older people, they don't move as much. So now the silver lining, Chris, is good news. We still have people coming. It could be worse. We could be in a state where you just don't have many people coming, and that's a problem economically, I think. So, but yeah, Chris, you told me before the show, you think there are too many people here already. So you want them to go away?
I don't know if they need to go away, but it does feel like there's a lot of people here. But you're right. I'm one of the people who did come from a state that does everything they can to keep people there and try to attract business. And for some reason, no one wants to move to Wyoming. It's a little bit cold, not a lot going on there. So I understand if you're not growing, you're shrinking. So you can't say, okay, let's not worry about growth. So you do have to grow, even though we're a very big state and there's a lot of people here. But
there's been a lot of states who feel that way. I heard Dave Ramsey, who lives in Tennessee, I think, say, try to stop coming to Tennessee. Tennessee is another state that's had population explosion growth. Texas has had it, a lot of Sunbelt states, but I think it is cooling, and we need to start looking at this as an indicator of what's happening here in Texas. Are things starting to slow down? And we all need to be, if you're in business, something to think about. So that brings our show to a close. Thank you so much to my very gracious co-host, Christopher B. Heel. I want to remind everybody to like us, follow us, review us wherever you get your podcast. Please do that. As a reminder, nothing in this show is to be considered legal advice. This has all been for entertainment purposes only. If you do have a legal question, please email us at info@silblawfirm.com, SILB like boy lawfirm.com. Although please don't email us a question about fixtures. We've tapped that one out for the rest of the year. Everybody have a great rest of your week and weekend.